Deep in the forgotten woods, where sunlight filtered through ancient trees, Grace Miller stood before a weathered cabin, her three children huddled close behind her. 2 weeks ago, she had been a respected office manager. Today, she was jobless, homeless, and desperate. The cabin, its windows clouded with decades of dust, seemed to call to her like an answered prayer. October rain tapped a melancholy rhythm on the roof of her old Chevrolet, now stranded at the edge of the forest road leading to Oak Ridge. The engine's final sputter still echoed in Grace's mind as she gathered her children and what little they could carry. "How much farther, Mom?" Ethan asked, his 12-year-old voice trying to maintain the cheerful tone he'd adopted since they'd left their apartment. The brave face of a boy trying to be the man of the family. "I don't know, sweetheart," Grace admitted, adjusting the backpack containing their remaining valuables. She glanced at Hannah, her 16-year-old daughter, who walked slightly apart, arms crossed, face set in the mask of teenage stoicism she'd worn since the divorce 2 years ago. Little Sophie, only 8, held Grace's hand tightly, her other arm clutching a worn rabbit plush. The one item Grace couldn't bear to make her leave behind when they packed up their lives into 4 suitcases. The narrow path wound deeper into the woods, twilight approaching faster than Grace had anticipated. They had been heading toward Oak Ridge, the small town where her grandmother Elizabeth had once owned a cottage. Grace doubted the place still existed, but she remembered camping grounds nearby, a temporary solution until she could figure out their next steps. Then, like an answered prayer, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. And there it stood, a cabin, its wooden structure weathered but intact, a small porch with sagging steps and windows filmed with decades of dust. It seemed to be waiting for them. Have you ever had to start completely over? I'd truly love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes life's greatest challenges lead us to unexpected blessings. "Mom, we can't just break in," Hannah whispered as Grace tested the door handle. "We're not breaking in. We're seeking shelter in an emergency," Grace responded, the door swinging open with a haunting creak. "We'll find the owner tomorrow and explain." Inside, dust motes danced in beams of light filtering through dirty windows. A stone fireplace dominated one wall opposite a small kitchen area with an ancient wood stove like those from the 1950s, its chrome handles dull with age. A wooden table with 3 chairs stood in the center. A narrow staircase led to what Grace assumed was a loft area. "It's like a fairy tale house," Sophie whispered. "It's probably full of spiders," Ethan countered, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Grace ran a finger along the dusty mantel. "It hasn't been lived in for years, but the structure seems sound." They spent the remaining daylight clearing cobwebs and sweeping decades of dust from the wooden floor. Grace found old blankets in a cedar chest that, once vigorously shaken outside, would serve as bedding. In the kitchen cabinets, she discovered vintage blue willow china plates and cups, the kind her grandmother had treasured. As night fell, the family huddled together on the floor before the fireplace, using jackets as pillows. The children fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's events. Grace remained awake, watching shadows dance across their faces by the light of her single candle. She'd kept her fears at bay for their sake, but alone with her thoughts, the gravity of their situation pressed down. Jobless, homeless, 3 children depending on her. The meager severance from her position at Remington Financial Services had barely covered their final rent payment. After 12 years of dedication, she'd been discarded in a 2-minute conversation about corporate restructuring. The flickering light caught something in the corner of the room, the edge of what appeared to be an old trunk partially hidden beneath a tattered blanket. Too tired to investigate further, Grace made a mental note to check it in the morning. For now, she allowed herself one quiet moment of tears before extinguishing the candle and joining her children in uneasy sleep. Morning light streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating dancing dust motes. Grace woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings before yesterday's events flooded back. Her children still slept, huddled together on the wooden floor. The trunk in the corner beckoned. Grace carefully extricated herself from Sophie's grasp and crossed the room, kneeling beside the mysterious container. It was old but well-crafted, leather straps reinforcing the corners, a brass lock securing its contents. She tried the lid, locked as expected. "What do you think is inside?" Ethan's voice startled her. He stood behind her, hair tousled from sleep. "I don't know, but it's not ours to open." "Maybe there's a key somewhere," he suggested, his eyes bright with adventure. As the day progressed, they established priorities, finding water, food, and assessing their temporary shelter. To Grace's relief, a hand pump well stood behind the cabin, still functional after some priming. The water ran clear and cold after the initial rusty flow. Inside, they continued cleaning. Hannah tackled the small kitchen area, while Ethan explored the loft space. Sophie stayed close to Grace, helping sweep decades of dust from the floors. "Mom, look!" Sophie pointed to something glinting in the debris near the fireplace. Grace knelt down to find a small, ornate key partially buried in ash and dust. Its head was decorated with an intricate leaf pattern. "Maybe it opens the trunk," Ethan exclaimed, scrambling down from the loft ladder. Grace hesitated. "This isn't our property, Ethan. We shouldn't pry." "But nobody's been here in forever," Hannah joined them, wiping dust from her hands. "And we need to know more about this place if we're staying here temporarily." Grace weighed their situation. They needed shelter, and understanding more about the cabin might help them locate its owner. With reluctance, she approached the trunk and slipped the key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease. The lid creaked open, revealing neatly organized contents protected by a layer of oilcloth. Grace carefully lifted out the items: leather-bound journals, yellowed maps, and a folded document that appeared to be a property deed. "Property of Abigail Winters, 1952, she read from the first journal. She turned to the first entry. April 12th, 1952. "The cabin is more dilapidated than I remembered from childhood visits. But these walls are mine alone. After 15 years of a marriage that slowly erased me, I finally found the courage to leave. Charles will be furious when he discovers I fled to my grandfather's old hunting cabin. But he always considered this land worthless. Too remote, too wild. Its very worthlessness is my salvation." "She lived here alone?" Hannah asked, reading over Grace's shoulder. "Sounds like she was escaping something too," Grace murmured. She recognized the courage that must have taken in the 1950s, when divorced women faced harsh social stigma and few opportunities for independence. The deed granted ownership of the cabin and surrounding acreage to Alexander Winters, Abigail's grandfather. Grace studied it carefully, noticing the property boundaries described were extensive. "We need to go into town," Grace decided, "find out more about this place and who might own it now." The following morning, Grace and Hannah walked the 2 miles into Oak Ridge. The small town seemed frozen in time. A white church steeple rising above maple trees displaying brilliant autumn colors, a town square with a white gazebo, brick storefronts with hand-painted signs. A group of elderly women in colorful cardigans gathered near the gazebo, quilting frames set up between them, a scene straight from another era. The sheriff's office occupied a modest building on the main street. Sheriff James Mitchell, a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, listened to their situation with an attentive expression. "The Winters cabin," he mused, leaning back in his chair. "Folks around here say it's haunted. Abigail Winters disappeared back in '57. Some say she just left town. Others," he shrugged. "Well, local legends get colorful over time." "Is there any record of who owns it now?" Grace asked. "Technically, the Hartwell Lumber Company claims most of that land. Richard Hartwell's grandfather, Walter Hartwell, acquired a lot of property around here in the 40s and 50s. His expression grew serious. I should warn you, Ms. Miller, Richard isn't known for his charitable nature. If he learns you're staying there, as if summoned by his name, the office door opened to reveal a tall, distinguished man in his late 60s. Richard Hartwell carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power, his tailored suit and polished shoes at odds with the casual attire of Oak Ridge residents. Sheriff Mitchell, he nodded curtly, then turned curious eyes to Grace. I don't believe we've met. Sheriff Mitchell made reluctant introductions. Ms. Miller's car broke down near the old Winters property. She and her children took shelter in the cabin temporarily. Hartwell's expression hardened. That's my property. I don't recall giving permission for anyone to occupy it. We didn't know, Grace explained. We were just seeking emergency shelter. The cabin seemed abandoned. It is abandoned with good reason. Hartwell's tone was clipped. It's not safe for habitation and is scheduled for demolition next spring as part of our new development project. Before Grace could respond, the door opened again. A woman in her 70s entered, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She stopped short at the sight of Hartwell. Martha, he acknowledged stiffly. Richard, the woman responded with equal coolness before turning her attention to Grace. You must be the folks staying at Abigail's place. Word travels fast in Oak Ridge? She extended her hand. Martha Thompson. I run the general store down the street. Martha Thompson had the weathered hands of someone who had worked hard all her life, but her eyes sparkled with warmth. She wore a brooch that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, a simple silver piece with a small pearl at its center. You and your children must be hungry. I brought some essentials to tide you over. We don't need to encourage squatters, Martha, Hartwell interjected. Neighborly kindness never goes amiss, Richard. Martha's tone was pleasant but firm. She turned to Grace. Actually, I could use some help at the store. Previous assistant left for college last month. Job comes with the apartment upstairs if you're interested. Grace could hardly believe their luck. That would be wonderful, Ms. Thompson. Call me Martha, dear. Everyone does. She glanced at Grace with an appraising look. You know, you remind me of her a bit. Same determined look in the eyes. Who? Abigail. Martha smiled enigmatically. Strong women recognize each other, even across time. Can you feel when a place calls to you? Have you ever been mysteriously guided somewhere that felt meant to be? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Grace worked mornings at Thompson's General Store, learning the rhythm of small-town commerce amid the vintage candy displays and glass jars of penny candies that Martha maintained, because some traditions shouldn't die. Afternoons were spent at the cabin, where the family threw themselves into restoration. Hannah enrolled in the local high school, initially reluctant but gradually engaging. Ethan explored the surrounding woods, mapping trails and collecting interesting stones. Sophie spent hours in the overgrown garden, talking to herself, or as she insisted, to Ms. Abby. During this time, Grace met Michael Anderson, a local attorney in his early 50s, with prematurely silver hair and kind eyes. He often stopped by the store for coffee, lingering to chat about books and local history. You're doing remarkable work with that old cabin, he mentioned one day. I drive by occasionally on my way to the lake. It feels like it was waiting for us, Grace admitted, surprised by her candor with this relative stranger. Michael smiled. Some places choose their people. He hesitated, then added, I lost my wife 5 years ago. Cancer. Afterward, I couldn't bear our house in Boston. All those memories. Found myself driving without purpose and ended up here. Bought a little place by the lake the same day. This casual revelation of shared experience created a quiet bond between them. He began offering legal advice about their situation with the cabin, his visits becoming more frequent. Grace found herself increasingly drawn to Abigail's journals, reading by candlelight after the children were asleep. The parallels between their lives were striking. Both women suddenly on their own with uncertain futures. But Abigail had chosen her isolation, while Grace's had been thrust upon her. August 28, 1952. Charles finally tracked me down, arrived in his polished Packard, looking so out of place against these woods. He demanded I return to my senses in my home. When I refused, he grew ugly with threats, said he'd declare me mentally unfit, have me committed. I stood my ground. This cabin has given me strength I never knew I possessed. Grace recognized the courage this took in an era when women had few legal rights and little economic independence. The isolation that had initially seemed threatening now felt protective. The cabin was becoming a home, not just a shelter. One evening, Michael arrived with a folder under his arm, his expression serious. "I've been researching the Winters property records," he explained over coffee at the wooden table. "It's a fascinating and troubling legal history." He explained the complex concept of adverse possession, how occupying and improving abandoned property for a certain period could potentially lead to legal ownership. 7 years with color of title, meaning some documentation suggesting ownership, like Abigail's original deed, he explained. But Hartwell will fight it. His family's influence runs deep here. Why would he care so much about an old cabin? Grace wondered. Michael's expression turned serious. There's history here that few people discuss openly. Abigail Winters filed injunctions against Hartwell Lumber 3 times between 1954 and 1956, alleging fraudulent land acquisition practices. All were dismissed for lack of evidence. What kind of fraudulent practices? According to local stories, many families lost land to Hartwell Lumber in the 40s and 50s. Properties declared tax delinquent and sold at auction, despite owners claiming taxes were paid. Nothing was ever proven. He paused. After each dismissal, Abigail would disappear for weeks, then return with new documentation. She was building a case methodically until she disappeared completely in 1957. Grace felt a chill. What do you think happened to her? The official story is she abandoned the property, left town to start fresh elsewhere. Michael didn't sound convinced. But there are those who believe she found something that made her dangerous to certain powerful people. Their conversation was interrupted by Sophie rushing in from the garden, clutching something in her small hand. "Look what I found, Mom! Miss Abby showed me where to dig." In her palm lay a smooth stone about the size of an egg, etched with intricate symbols, curves and angles forming what appeared to be directional markers. "Sophie, who is Miss Abby?" Grace asked gently. "The lady who lives here," Sophie replied matter-of-factly. "She wears a blue dress with a white collar, like in those old TV shows, and she has really long hair. She likes watching us fix her house." Grace and Michael exchanged concerned glances, but the stone was undeniably real and reminiscent of markings in Abigail's journals. Later that evening, as Grace tucked Sophie into bed in the newly cleaned loft, she approached the subject carefully. "Sweetheart, this Miss Abby you talked to, do you actually see her?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "Not all the time, but she sits in the garden a lot, or by the fireplace. She's sad sometimes, but mostly happy now that we're here." "And she told you where to find the stone?" "She said it's part of a treasure map. There are more stones, and they lead to something important that bad people tried to hide." Grace smoothed Sophie's hair. "Grandma Elizabeth used to say some people have a special gift, a third eye that lets them see things others can't. Maybe that's what you have." "Miss Abby says we need to hurry. The bad man is getting closer." The next morning brought rain, heavy, persistent rain that transformed the forest into a sodden maze. Sheriff Mitchell's patrol car pulled up beside the cabin, bringing news that sent ice through Grace's veins. "Hartwell filed for emergency eviction," he explained apologetically, "claiming unsafe habitation and trespassing. You have 30 days to vacate. 30 days, but it's nearly winter. Where would we go? Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry, Grace. Court orders are binding until the hearing. He glanced toward the woods. Hartwell's been asking questions about how much renovation you've done, almost like he was waiting for you to improve the property before making his move. Sometimes our greatest challenges lead to our most important discoveries. Have you experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments. The rain continued for days, turning the clearing into a muddy swamp and confining the family indoors. Tensions simmered as the eviction deadline drew closer. 19 days remaining. Grace stared at a family photograph that had fallen from her wallet. The last picture taken before her ex-husband Robert left, her family whole, before he traded them for a younger woman and a new life. The glass was cracked now, splitting the image, a fitting metaphor. Any word from Michael? Hannah asked, entering with a stack of Abigail's journals. Court denied his motion to delay the eviction. He's filing an appeal, but we're running out of time, Hannah finished flatly, and we can't search in this weather. The disappointment in her daughter's voice triggered something in Grace, a surge of guilt and self-doubt. I'm sorry I brought you into this mess, she blurted. Maybe we should be looking for another place to live instead of chasing Abigail's ghosts. Hannah looked up sharply. You want to give up? I want what's best for you kids. A stable home, not some legal battle we'll probably lose. This is our home, Hannah insisted, her voice rising. We've put everything into it. You can't just quit when things get hard. I'm trying to be realistic. No, you're being a coward, just like with Dad. You didn't fight then either. Grace recoiled as if slapped. That was different. Was it? Because it feels exactly the same. Things get tough, and you look for the exit. Hannah gathered the journals. Maybe Abigail picked the wrong family for her treasure. She stormed upstairs to the loft, leaving Grace stunned by her daughter's outburst. The worst part was the kernel of truth in Hannah's accusation. When her marriage had collapsed, Grace had accepted defeat without a fight, too exhausted by years of emotional neglect to battle for anything beyond child support. Ethan and Sophie had witnessed the argument from the kitchen doorway. Sophie retreated to her corner by the window, whispering to her invisible friend. Ethan approached Grace cautiously. We can't give up, Mom, he said, his young face serious. Ms. Abby picked a special. Oh, honey. She did, he insisted. Sophie talks to her, but I feel her too, like she's watching out for us. Before Grace could respond, the cabin door banged open as Hannah reappeared, rain-soaked and frantic. Ethan's gone, she cried. I went to apologize and he wasn't in the loft. His raincoat's missing. Grace ran to check the back door. It stood ajar, Ethan's muddy footprints leading toward the forest. Why would he? He heard us fighting, Sophie said quietly. He told Ms. Abby he would find the boundary marker himself. Panic surged through Grace. The woods were treacherous in this weather. Rain-swollen creeks, slippery slopes, limited visibility. Call Sheriff Mitchell, she ordered Hannah, grabbing her own raincoat. Tell him we need help, then stay with Sophie. I'm coming with you, Hannah insisted, already pulling on boots. Absolutely not. I can't risk both of you out there. This is my fault too. Hannah's voice broke. Please, Mom. Grace recognized the determination in her daughter's eyes, the same fierce protection that had emerged when Hannah became the de facto second parent after their divorce. Fine, but Sophie stays locked inside. Call Michael too. They followed Ethan's rapidly disappearing tracks into the forest, calling his name. The downpour muffled their voices and limited visibility to mere yards. Direction became meaningless in the green labyrinth. He was heading toward the western boundary, Hannah shouted over the rain, where the old creek meets the ridge. How do you know? He's been studying Abigail's maps for days, said that's where the trees form an X. They pressed forward, fighting through underbrush and mud. An hour into their search, with daylight fading and hope diminishing, Sheriff Mitchell's voice crackled over a bullhorn, organizing volunteer searchers from town. "We need to split up," Hannah suggested. "Cover more ground." "No," Grace grabbed her arm. "We stay together. Mom, we're running out of daylight. Ethan could be hurt." The fear in Hannah's voice mirrored Grace's own. She made a decision. "Take this." She handed Hannah a flashlight and an emergency whistle. "Stay on the ridge trail. I'll follow the creek bed. 3 whistle blasts if you find him." They separated, each fighting their own path through the storm. Grace slogged along the swollen creek, shouting Ethan's name until her voice grew hoarse. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Ethan injured, lost, or worse. Just as full darkness threatened, a distant whistle pierced the storm. 3 sharp blasts. Grace scrambled toward the sound, slipping and falling repeatedly in her desperate rush. She found Hannah and Sheriff Mitchell standing beside a massive oak that had been struck by lightning years ago. Its split trunk formed a perfect X with a neighboring pine that had grown through the gap. And there, huddled in a hollow at the base, was Ethan, wet, muddy, but gloriously unharmed. "Mom!" he cried, launching into her arms. "I found it. I found Abigail's marker." In his hand was a carved stone identical to the first clue. Uncovered when the lightning struck, oak's roots had partially uprooted during the storm. Back at the cabin, wrapped in blankets before the fire they'd coaxed to life, Ethan explained his reckless expedition. "I wanted to prove we shouldn't give up, that we were meant to find this place." Grace's relief had given way to a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for her son's safety, amazement at his discovery, and a dawning realization of what truly mattered. "I'm sorry," she said, looking from Ethan to Hannah. "You were right. This place, it does mean something, and we shouldn't give up without a fight." Hannah's eyes softened. "I'm sorry, too. What I said about Dad had some truth to it," Grace admitted. "I was afraid then. I'm still afraid now. But you've both shown more courage than I have." She took their hands. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Sophie, who had been unusually quiet since their return, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Abby says the last clue is here, in the hearth, where the heart of the home beats." She knelt beside the fireplace and pressed her small palm against a stone adorned with a barely visible leaf carving identical to the pattern on the key. "Push here, then pull the iron ring," she instructed. Grace knelt beside Sophie, located the carved stone, and pressed firmly. A soft click rewarded her effort. The iron ring, an ornamental fixture they had assumed was merely decorative, now seemed purposeful. Grace grasped it and gave an experimental tug. To everyone's astonishment, a section of the hearth floor shifted, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside lay a heavy iron key in a folded piece of parchment. The note, in Abigail's now familiar handwriting, read, "For those who seek truth with pure hearts." The final threshold lies beneath the heart of the home. Beneath the cabin, Hannah wondered. Careful inspection revealed a seam in the floorboards running along the edge of the stone hearth. When pulled, a trap door swung upward, exposing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Grace took a deep breath. "I'll go first." The stairs creaked but held firm as she descended into the cool darkness, flashlight illuminating a small room with a packed earth floor and stone walls. Unlike the damp mustiness she expected, the air smelled surprisingly fresh. Some ventilation system had kept the space habitable. "Abigail created a hidden vault," Michael whispered, joining her after arriving at the cabin. "Ingenious." The room contained a simple wooden table and chair, a wall of built-in shelves, and an old steamer trunk. Every surface was covered with carefully preserved documents, maps, photographs, and ledgers. "It's all here," Grace breathed, examining the nearest shelf. "Everything Abigail collected." Michael lifted a bound volume from the table. These are original land surveys from the 1890s when Alexander Winters first settled this property. He picked up another document. And here are the original deeds with proper boundary descriptions that match the early survey maps. As the children explored the hidden archive, Grace turned her attention to the steamer trunk, secured with a padlock. The iron key from the hearth compartment fit perfectly. Inside lay the most damning evidence of all, ledgers documenting systematic fraud by Walter Hartwell, complete with dates, property descriptions, and amounts paid to county officials for falsifying records. Most shocking was a leather-bound journal with Charles Winters embossed on the cover, Abigail's husband's personal record of his role in the scheme, followed by his crisis of conscience. Charles worked for the county assessor's office, Michael explained, examining the journal. According to this, he was pressured by Walter Hartwell to falsify tax records, making it appear families hadn't paid their taxes when they had. This proves the Hartwell fortune was built on fraudulently obtained lands, Grace realized. The current property lines are all based on falsified records. Not just the cabin, Hannah said, studying a large map. According to these original documents, nearly half of what's now Hartwell property legally belongs to other families, including the entire northern tract where they're planning the new development. No wonder Richard is so determined to evict us, Grace said. If this evidence became public, it would trigger the largest property dispute in county history. Amid the documents, Grace found a sealed envelope addressed simply "To whom it may concern." Inside was Abigail's will, dated 1 week before her disappearance in 1957. I, Abigail Winters, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath my property and all improvements thereon to those who need it as I once did. Souls seeking refuge and justice, may they find both within these walls. She left the cabin to whoever found her treasure, Hannah whispered. To us. But the most shocking discovery came from a small, carefully wrapped package at the bottom of the trunk. Inside was a lock of hair, a baby's footprint card, and a faded photograph of an infant. She had a child, Grace whispered, reading the single line written on the back of the photo. My daughter, April 1953. The following week, the county commissioners convened a special hearing. The town hall overflowed with residents, many elderly citizens who had lived in Oak Ridge all their lives. Dressed in their Sunday best, these witnesses to history waited with anticipation. Richard Hartwell sat with his attorneys, his confidence visibly shaken as Michael presented document after document, revealing decades of land fraud. These aren't just historical curiosities, Michael explained to the commissioners. These are evidence of systematic fraud that has never been rectified. The statute of limitations on fraud doesn't apply when concealment continues, which it has, through ongoing false property claims. Elderly residents stood to share stories of family lands mysteriously declared tax delinquent despite receipts showing payment. One by one, they painted a picture of a community systematically robbed of its heritage. During a recess, Hartwell approached Grace. I'm prepared to offer you a generous settlement, he said quietly. Full ownership of the cabin and surrounding 5 acres, plus $250,000 compensation for your inconvenience. In exchange for what? Grace asked, though she already knew. The documents, all of them, and your silence. Grace felt Hannah stiffen beside her. She thought of Abigail, fighting her lonely battle for justice, of the families who had lost their land, of Sophie's unwavering belief in the cabin lady's guidance. Those documents don't just concern us, Grace replied steadily. They affect dozens of families whose land was stolen. Alleged theft from 70 years ago, Hartwell countered. Opening this Pandora's box will only create chaos and uncertainty. Legal battles could drag on for years. Years your children could spend growing up in a secure home with their education funded. His eyes narrowed slightly. or you could spend those years fighting a losing battle against Hartwell Lumber. The corporation employs half this town. It was a threat veiled as concern. Before Grace could respond, Martha Thompson stepped forward from where she had been quietly observing. "I remember when your father used those same tactics, Richard," she said quietly, "when the Miller farm was suddenly reassessed after they refused to sell. Or when the Jacobson place mysteriously burned after old Carl challenged a boundary line. The final bombshell came when DNA testing was performed on the lock of hair found in Abigail's archives. Martha Thompson was Abigail Winter's daughter, given to the childless Thompson couple for protection when Abigail realized how dangerous her evidence gathering had become. "I always felt a connection to Abigail," Martha revealed, tears in her eyes. "Martha and Robert Thompson were wonderful parents, but there was always something missing. Now I understand why Abigail watched me from afar all those years." Records discovered in California confirmed Abigail hadn't died or simply disappeared. She had fled west with a new identity as Eleanor White, living quietly until her death in 1998, never revealing her true identity, but keeping newspaper clippings about Oak Ridge and the Hartwell Corporation. 6 months later, the cabin stood transformed. Fresh paint brightened the exterior, new glass gleamed in the windows, and a wooden swing hung from the sturdy branch of a nearby oak. The garden, once overgrown wilderness, now flourished with vegetables, herbs, and Abigail's heirloom flowers, grown from preserved seeds they'd found in her hidden compartment. The Abigail Winters Memorial Trust had been established, with Martha as trustee and lifetime tenancy rights granted to the Miller family. The restitution fund had helped 16 families reclaim properties or receive compensation for Hartwell's fraudulent acquisitions. Richard Hartwell himself had resigned as CEO and relocated to Florida. His family's influence in Oak Ridge diminished to a shadow of its former power. On the cabin's porch, Grace sat with Michael, watching Hannah prepare for college. Her scholarship essay on Abigail Winters and women's property rights in the 1950s had garnered national attention. Ethan led groups of local children on historical tours of the woods, while Sophie tended the garden, occasionally conversing with someone only she could see. Over the past months, Grace and Michael had grown closer, their friendship deepening through shared challenges and quiet evenings, discussing books on the porch. He understood her reluctance to rush into a new relationship, respecting her need to establish independence first. "Do you think she's really there?" Michael asked softly. "Abigail?" Grace considered the question. "I don't know. But I do know that some spirits never truly leave the places they loved." She took his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Some connections transcend time." Martha joined them, bringing a plate of cookies freshly baked from a recipe found in Abigail's papers. "The quilting circle is making an Abigail Winters memorial quilt," she announced, each square representing a family whose land is being restored. As twilight settled over the clearing, Grace felt a profound sense of peace. What had begun as desperate shelter had become a true home. The journey hadn't been easy, but like Abigail before her, Grace had found her strength in these walls and in the family that had weathered the storm together. "There are houses that are just buildings," she murmured, "and there are houses where souls find peace. We found not just a shelter, but a legacy, a mission, and a new beginning." In the garden, Sophie placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the porch steps. "Ms. Abby says she's happy we found home," she announced with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child. And in the gentle evening breeze that rustled through the ancient trees, Grace could almost hear a whispered response. "Welcome home,